What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with another one of my top 10 videos, this time celebrating the career of one of my favorite directors working today, the legendary iconoclast, Paul Verhoeven. Quick question for all of you. Off the top of your head, how many directors can you think of who've been active for more than 50 years, where they've managed to make great movies every step of the way? Werner Herzog comes to mind, Martin Scorsese, but my point is that it is a very short list. The longevity of Paul Verhoeven is just awe-inspiring, with 3 distinct phases to his career: his early Dutch period, the years where he took over Hollywood, and finally his elder statesman phase, where he continues to make amazing movies back in Holland and in France. I've got movies from all 3 phases on my list, and he has enough amazing work to his name where there's not enough room on my list for every classic film to make the cut. I had to redo my list multiple times as I went back and rewatched every single one of his movies preparing for this video. And I've been watching his movies my entire life, but after doing the deep dive for this video, I can safely say I'm more impressed by Paul Verhoeven than ever before. I'm fascinated by his energy, his intellect, his overwhelming enthusiasm for exploring new frontiers. But most of all, I'm just blown away by his filmography, which is filled with these wildly entertaining movies that make most conventional films feel about as exciting as chewing on cardboard. Paul Verhoeven has just never played it safe. His movies are shocking, provocative, frequently challenging our assumptions or whatever narratives we might be clinging to, all while stimulating and titillating us right down to our taste buds the way great art should. In an era where so many filmmakers pander to the dumbest audience members or the most sensitive audience members, Paul Verhoeven is a vivid reminder that cinema can be explosive, complex, and controversial and still generate great box office. Not that he has a perfect track record. He's made his fair share of flops that were attacked for a variety of ridiculous reasons in their day, but he's had the last laugh with nearly all of his films finding a rabid fan base over time. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. There's so much I want to get to in my list, but let me slow down and share a few quick key facts about Paul Verhoeven. He was born in 1938, and his earliest years were dominated by the German occupation of Holland. He lived near The Hague, and the sight of burning buildings and dead bodies were absolutely the norm for him. But he says from his young point of view, it all just felt like this crazy adventure. But these experiences would later inform his incredible World War II movies, Soldier of Orange and Black Book. But as a young man, he studied mathematics and physics, and his father desperately wanted him to have a career in academia. And as late as the mid-1980s, while Paul Verhoeven was making Robocop, his father would continue to send him letters telling him about part-time teaching positions that he thought he should apply for. Luckily for us, Paul Verhoeven decided to surrender to his urge to making movies, making his first short films throughout the 1960s, even during the years that he spent with the Dutch Navy. But finally, in the late 60s, Paul Verhoeven went pro with the hit show Floris, starring the legendary Rutger Hauer, with whom he would continue to collaborate on movies like Turkish Delight, Katie Tipple, Soldier of Orange, Spetters, and Flesh and Blood. But over the decades, he's enjoyed an incredible stock company of amazing actors, and please forgive my horrible American pronunciation of their names, but I'm talking about brilliant performers like Jeroen Krabbe, Monique van de Ven, and Renee Satendij. Jesus, there's no way I got those names right. But just as important as his collaboration with his actors were his partners in crime behind the camera. Paul Verhoeven's the first to admit that this is not a one-man show. You really need about 15 great collaborators to make a cool movie, starting with great material. And throughout his career, Paul Verhoeven's repeatedly worked with certain key writers, directors of photography, and composers over and over again, and all of them have left their fingerprints all over his work. But Jan de Bont, he shot 6 of his movies: Business is Business, Turkish Delight, Katie Tipple, The Fourth Man, Flesh and Blood, and Basic Instinct. Jos Vakano shot 7 of his movies, including Soldier of Orange, Spetters, Robocop, Total Recall, Showgirls, Starship Troopers, and Hollow Man. And when it comes to music, Basil Polidorus gave him the scores to Flesh and Blood, Robocop, and Starship Troopers. The great Jerry Goldsmith gave him the scores to Total Recall, Basic Instinct, and Hollow Man. And recently, Ann Dudley composed the scores to Black Book, Elle, and Benedetta. But as far as writers go, Gerard Soteman, if I'm saying that correctly, he worked on 7 projects with Verhoeven: Turkish Delight, Katie Tipple, Soldier of Orange, Spetters, The Fourth Man, Flesh and Blood, and Black Book. And if you're a sci-fi nut, let's not forget writer Ed Neumeyer, who worked on Robocop, Starship Troopers, and the recently announced film Young Sinner, which Paul Verhoeven is planning on directing soon. So I think it's time to get down to business with my list. Over the last few weeks, I've been completely saturating my brain with Paul Verhoeven movies, as well as his many interviews online and his absolutely fantastic director commentaries, all of which you should hunt down. But I think I've finally landed on a list that I can live with for the time being, at least until he comes along and hopefully blows our minds one more time with another movie. Fingers crossed, please, baby Jesus, don't take Paul Verhoeven away from us anytime soon. But each one of his movies that did not make the list, I would absolutely include as an honorable mention, except for Hollow Man, where even Paul Verhoeven stated in his own words, the movie has no soul and it's about nothing. But as far as the rest of the honorable mentions go, his first feature film, Business is Business, is an absolutely hysterical movie about the day-to-day lives of hookers in Amsterdam. Tricked is so much damn fun. It's light, it's sexy, and beautifully short. And speaking of short, Paul Verhoeven's episode of the HBO series The Hitchhiker is well worth hunting down. Katie Tipple might not have had the scale and scope that Paul Verhoeven wanted, but it's still a fascinating and often lurid rags-to-riches story set in late 19th century Amsterdam. Benedetto is one of my favorite movies of 2021 and proof that Paul Verhoeven is still firing on all cylinders. And Flesh and Blood, while a bit of a mess, is one of the filthiest romantic adventure stories you will ever see. With all the brutality, depravity, nudity, pestilence, and warfare you would expect to see in Italy in 1501, it was also the first of Paul Verhoeven's many wars with the MPAA and their ridiculously inconsistent rating systems, but luckily, Paul Verhoeven has won most of these battles throughout his career. As he once said, a little war is not so bad. But of all the strong contenders for the number 10 spot, I decided to go with The Fourth Man, an intensely erotic Hitchcockian thriller that in hindsight feels like the perfect warm-up for Basic Instinct nearly a decade later. The plot is not the same at all, but we have a famous writer played by Joren Krabbe, we have same-sex relationships, we have a beautiful, mysterious woman played by Renee Satenjic, who has a reputation of leading her past lovers and husbands to their deaths, and we have what is all around just a wild story, full of religious imagery, horrific death scenes, dreams of castration, and a bizarre love affair. That's all part of this elaborate ruse by Krabbe's character, who claims he can cure Renee's boyfriend's premature ejaculation problem, but really, he just wants to get it on with them. This movie is truly outlandish and a great obscure gem in Paul Verhoeven's overall filmography. But number 9, Black Book. Between Soldier of Orange and Black Book, Paul Verhoeven's made what are two of the best films we will ever see about the Dutch resistance during World War II. I have a lot of love for both movies, but ultimately I decided to go with Black Book from my list. At the time it was released, it was both the most expensive and the most commercially successful film ever made in Holland, and in 2008 the Dutch public voted it the best Dutch movie ever made. The story focuses on a young Jew played by Carice van Houten, who goes undercover as a spy named Ellis, pretending to work for the Nazis in the closing days of World War II. The film is so erotic, but it's also thrilling and horrifying, and what I find so refreshing is how this is not some jingoistic piece of propaganda. The film is brutally frank and honest about the horrors of that period, including the frequently anti-Semitic attitudes to be found in those who are on the same side as Ellis. All too quickly, she gets thrown under the bus by her allies, who are tricked into believing she's a traitor, resulting in a fate that never fails to make me dry heave and gag each time I see it. But overall, this is a strong contender for my favorite movie about World War II made in the 21st century, and I strongly urge everyone to hunt it down. And while we're on the subject of war, from a number 8, we've got the sci-fi classic Starship Troopers. I took my little brother and sister to see this in the theater when it first came out, and we had an absolute blast, and I've loved it ever since. To this day, when I hear that score as the characters are facing overwhelming odds, I still get chills up and down my back. And today this sci-fi war film enjoys legions of fans, and justifiably so, but that was not always the case. Many film critics initially bashed the film, calling Verhoeven a neo-fascist, proving once again that critics on the whole are a rather humorless bunch, because first and foremost, this is not a dogmatic movie. At all. Paul Verhoeven says that he and screenwriter Ed Neumeyer were howling with laughter as they reworked the militaristic source material into an ironic story that works on two levels, where the heroes of the story are on the road to fascism but don't know it yet. But the greatest irony is that this movie got made at all by a major studio, which Paul Verhoeven says was only possible due to this game of musical chairs that was going on at Sony at the time, where the studio heads were coming and going every few months. Works for me. A quarter century after its release, the special effects still look brand spanking new, and I think if you release it today, it would still feel incredibly modern. Very few studio movies are so entertaining 25 years after the fact, and it fills me with hope for film culture in general, seeing this movie develop a larger fan base with each passing year. But number 7, Turkish Delight. So the early 70s will always be my favorite era of filmmaking, where visionary directors all around the world were making provocative films that redefined the limits of what was possible in cinema. When it comes to sex on the big screen, Turkish Delight was just this cultural hand grenade and the first real classic of Paul Verhoeven's career. Verhoeven says he tried focusing on shooting sex that he knew and understood personally in order to avoid the trap of drifting into pornography, but more importantly, he tried to follow the style of the best-selling book it was based on, a book which has been described as sparing neither the morality nor the senses of the reader. Well, it worked. Turkish Delight is one of the most popular movies ever released in Holland. We have Rutger Hauer and Monique van de Ven embroiled in one of the most chaotic, libidinous love affairs I've ever seen depicted on the screen. And if you blush easily, this movie will make you turn crimson 10 times over, with Rutger Hauer boldly declaring, "I fuck better than God," or the scene where he's ranting and raving, but wanting to lick the shit out of his girlfriend's ass as he jacks off to her picture. For my taste, I wouldn't say this movie's necessarily a turn-on. There are just way too many boner killers in the movie, like watching Rutger Hauer digging through his girlfriend's feces when she thinks she sees blood in it. But the movie is funny as hell, like watching a woman rocking her baby in a stroller as she does the business with Rutger Hauer. But also, I find the movie to be incredibly moving with this hauntingly beautiful score by Roger van Otterloo, if I'm saying that correctly. But this is one of those movies that just has to be seen to be believed, and it's the first real indication that Paul Verhoeven was on his way to becoming one of the world's great directors. But let's push on to my number 6, Total Recall. I first saw this bad boy in the theater just shy of my 14th birthday, long before I had any idea who Paul Verhoeven might be, or what it meant for this movie to be based on a short story by sci-fi legend Philip K. Dick. All that mattered to me at the time was that I was a massive fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and holy shit, this movie delivered with one of the most hardcore, kick-ass movies of both their careers. And it absolutely kills me that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Paul Verhoeven never got to make their movie about the Crusades, but Total Recall was the first of 3 movies that Paul Verhoeven made for Carolco, a production company that was the perfect partner in crime for him, and it still wounds me that they went out of business in 1995, but that's another topic for another video. But at the time I first saw Total Recall, it completely blew my mind that this story could be enjoyed at face value on the surface, or as an elaborate fantasy memory implanted in the mind of Douglas Quaid. But this movie has so much to offer, like some really sensational practical effects courtesy of the great Rob Bottin, or Sharon Stone in badass action villain mode kicking Arnold Schwarzenegger right in the balls. What always gets me is the overt, aggressive sexuality that Paul Verhoeven does better than anyone.
Still bulging, I see. What you been feeding this thing?
Blondes.
And come to think of it, Paul Verhoeven does a lot of things better than anyone, and that's why he's one of my favorite filmmakers today. But number 5, it is time to get into Showgirls. People have said a lot of things about this movie over the years, but no matter how you feel, I think we can all agree that Showgirls is never boring, which is more than I can say for 99% of the movies I've watched over the years. Showgirls is just a delirious, unhinged experience from start to finish, and I think Tarantino hit the nail on the head when he said, the thing that's great about Showgirls, and I mean great with a capital great, is that only one other time in the last 20 years has a major studio made a full-on, gigantic, big-budget exploitation movie. Showgirls is the Mandingo of the 90s. Now, I'm not going to lie and claim that I was hip enough to appreciate this movie upon initial release, because I wasn't. This movie came out the fall of my first year at UVA, and not only did I not yet know Paul Verhoeven's work by name, but I was totally distracted with my social life. You would think that at age 19 that this movie would have automatically been my bread and butter, but for a brief shining moment in my life, I wasn't really thinking about movies at all. So I rediscovered the movie in the early 2000s, and I couldn't believe that I'd managed to overlook this insane, frenzied, hyperbolic, over-the-top experience.
I've had dog food.
You have?
Long time ago. Doggy chow. Oh, I used to love doggy chow.
I used to love doggy chow too.
In one of his many interviews with the Film Society of Lincoln Center, Paul Verhoeven compared his approach to the movie with the work of expressionistic artist Otto Dix. I don't know shit about art, but that works for me. In any case, people love to shit on this movie, calling it a flop because it only grossed $20 million on a budget of $40, but the movie ended up earning more than $100 million on home video, so say whatever you like about this movie. A failure, it absolutely is not. The movie fucking rocks, and if you don't believe me, watch it again. Number 4, let's get back into Paul Verhoeven's Dutch films with yet another controversial movie, but one that was a commercial smash in Holland, Spetters. The movie's been called anti-this and anti-that, and while the movie might certainly be one of the most shocking of Paul Verhoeven's career, I also think it's one of Paul Verhoeven's best. But if you have any hang-ups at all, brace yourself. Spetters has more dick shots than any movie I've seen, apart from maybe Jackass Forever, or maybe In the World of Pornography, and the path that one character takes towards realizing that he's gay is, to put it mildly, unconventional, but in the end, Spetters has more life and excitement and intensity than 1,000 other movies put together. It's a completely uninhibited look at the lives of 3 dirt bikers who are all dreaming of going pro, as well as going to bed with the hottie who sells fast food at all their races. A large part of the controversy surrounding the film stemmed from the fact that it was made with government subsidies. His critics on the left thought the film was decadent, perverted, and had no social agenda. From my point of view, that sounds like a compliment, but this made it very hard for him to find financing in the future. As a result, he would make only one more movie in Holland on a much smaller budget before finally teaming up with Hollywood. And while we're on the subject of controversy from a number 3, let's go ahead and tackle Elle, an astonishing movie where a lot of people tied themselves in knots trying to understand its undeniable power. Elle is the story of a woman who refuses to be victimized after being brutally raped, and the main reason it works is Isabelle Huppert, a strong contender for the most daring and talented actress of her generation. At the New York Film Festival, Paul Verhoeven and Isabelle Huppert sat down for this fascinating Q&A, where Verhoeven admitted he basically didn't direct Huppert, apart from discussing a few superficial details like wardrobe.
But it's true to say that I don't really bother with, with the idea that a character should be sympathetic. It's not really my problem. I just want the character to be as true as possible.
He completely deferred to her instincts and where she wanted to go with the character, often letting the cameras continue to roll long after the end of a scene. And she delivers one of the best performances of her career, right up there with a movie like Michael Haneke's The Piano Teacher. And what's great is how Huppert had been wanting to work with Verhoeven ever since she first saw Turkish Delight back in the 1970s, and the wait was well worth it. Her character is just fascinating, and perhaps the least sentimental character I've seen in movies over the last decade. She just gives zero fucks what people think, and I just love watching her in action, whether she's telling video game developers how to deliver boner moments in their latest project, or ridiculing her elderly mother for wanting to marry her favorite male prostitute, or giving her idiot son the tough love he needs to hear, or dealing with the legacy of her serial killer for her father, or shopping for the weapons that she may or may not use depending upon how she feels the next time she meets her attacker. Cynics out there love to say that cinema is dead, but for my money, cinema will never die as long as there remain artists like Verhoeven and Huppert who are willing to provoke audiences out of their complacency with stories of legitimately heart-stopping power. Number 2, at last we come to Basic Instinct. I was born in 1976, meaning I was a 15-year-old boy when this sucker hit theaters in March of 1992. I'm not sure it's possible for me to put into words exactly what kind of effect this movie had on horny teenagers at that time, especially at my single-sex boarding school out in the middle of nowhere, but suffice to say, the movie's impact was seismic. It's tough to remember the last time a sexy thriller just burned a hole right through the entire culture, becoming a scandalous runaway hit, but this flick had everything. It was gorgeously shot by Jan de Bont in location in San Francisco. It featured a hypnotic score by Jerry Goldsmith, horrific special effects by Rob Bottin, a deliciously sleazy script by Joe Esterhaas, and of course, some very game actors who took a look at Paul Verhoeven's storyboards for their sex scenes, said yes, and the rest is history. When it comes to sex in his movies, Paul Verhoeven likes to meticulously map out his sex scenes with as much choreography as an action scene, which he finds to be a far more effective approach than just telling actors, make it hot. But much has been made of Sharon Stone's notorious interrogation sequence and what Paul Verhoeven describes as the complete expression of her dominance. But on a technical level, I urge everyone to listen to the commentary track with Paul Verhoeven and Jan de Bont, hearing these two old friends and collaborators discussing their love of Hitchcock and Orson Welles, as well as getting into the nuts and bolts of their craft. It's a rare treat for film buffs, but more generally, for those of you who weren't around for the late 80s and early 90s, it was an era dominated by sexy thrillers, a genre that's basically extinct these days at the movies, but Basic Instinct remains the heavyweight champion of them all, a movie that will live in infamy in the best possible way as long as movies continue to be watched. And finally, we've reached my all-time favorite Paul Verhoeven film. From my number 1, we're going back to the very first movie by him that I ever saw, Robocop. This is one of the best genre films of the 1980s, and after you've had the balls-to-the-wall experience that this movie offers, most of today's superhero flicks seem so safe and generic and disposable. First of all, Robocop is a hard R. Name the last Marvel movie where a hero shot a rapist right in the dick. Better still, it was a brand new original concept, not ripping off or modernizing any existing intellectual property. But in addition to all the kick-ass action, the brilliant world building, the incredible effects by Rob Bottin, and the pulse-pounding score by Basil Polidorus, the movie also presents one of the best social satires of the 1980s, a world where big business, the military, and the criminal underworld are all kind of bleeding together into this super corporation of OCP. And I find it absolutely hysterical hearing both a big-time exec like Dick Jones as well as a cop killer like Clarence Boddicker using the exact same language like Good business is where you find it. But the political commentary in this movie is never obnoxious like in so many modern movies, because Paul Verhoeven understands that for a satire to really work, on another level, the story has to endorse the same behavior that it condemns. You have to have a thorough understanding of what makes these corrupt systems so seductive. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel a shred of pity when Miguel Ferrer's character is killed by Clarence Boddicker. I just rewatched Robocop last night, and I was floored all over again. Peter Weller was born to play this role, and the screenplay is just a thing of beauty. It's so damn tight and economical, ripping right through Murphy's origin story in record time, all while brilliantly using media breaks and commercials to flesh out the details of this strange, hyper-realistic world. I was listening to the commentary, and Paul Verhoeven brought up Federico Fellini's observation that directors tend to make the same movie over and over again. Well, Paul Verhoeven's always been preoccupied with crucifixion and resurrection. He owns thousands of books about the history of Jesus Christ, and he's always wanted to make a movie about him. But this fixation with Jesus leads to two scenes of unforgettable power. First, the cruel murder of Murphy, all while his killers are laughing in his face, and later, watching nearly the entire police force opening fire on him, all while the score swells. I nearly start weeping every time. It's just so damn powerful. But this is one of those special movies from my childhood that's just gotten better with age, and in my opinion, genre films just don't get any better. But sadly, we've reached the end of the road. I ended up writing and talking way more than I originally intended, but I'm fucking obsessed with this guy. But I think it's time to wrap up this particular video. I might return to the subject at a later date when Paul Verhoeven makes his next movie. But if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified for future content. Can't thank you enough for listening, but more importantly, as always,
Stay out of trouble.